The news came on the wind, a panicked shout carried from the cliffs. It tore through the salt-heavy air of the coastal village, snagging on fishing nets and rattling the shutters of the small stone cottages. The mine! The North Mine collapsed! Alara was grinding sea moss and iron root on her slate mortar, her hands stained with the earthy red of the root. The pestle stilled. Her head came up, listening not to the words but to the frantic energy behind them. It was a terror she knew, the gut-deep fear of the earth giving way. Then came the second shout, the one that stopped her heart. "The Alpha King! His wolf is trapped inside!" A clatter of steel and panicked growls erupted from the village square. The king's personal guard, stationed in their territory for the seasonal inspection, were mobilizing. She heard their heavy boots on the cobblestones, the voice of their captain barking orders that were frayed with desperation. Alara dropped the pestle. It rolled off her workbench and hit the packed earth floor with a dull thud. She didn't notice. Her gaze was fixed on the dark smudge against the gray sky to the north. The Iron Fang Mine. The old one, the forbidden one. She knew that mine, not as a place of ore and wealth, but as a place of strange growths and dangerous air. She was a healer, an herbalist. Her domain was the fringes, the shadowed places where potent and perilous things grew. She lived outside the main pack structure, tolerated for her skills but never truly part of it. An outsider. A scout, breathless and pale, stumbled past her open door, leaning against the frame to gasp for air. "He went in alone," the man choked out, his eyes wide with horror. "Chasing something. We heard the roar then. Silence. A tremor. The entrance is gone." Another guard ran up. "We can't get close. There's a gas." A shimmer in the air. The wolves who tried to dig went mad, clawing at their own faces. Alara's blood went cold. She knew that shimmer. Whisper moss. A rare phosphorescent fungus that grew only in deep, iron-rich caves. Its spores were harmless to humans, but to the heightened senses of a werewolf, they were a neurotoxin. They induced paranoia, hallucinations, rage, and she, for reasons she had never understood, was immune. She discovered it as a child, collecting lichens near the mine's mouth. While her pack mates got dizzy and sick, she had felt nothing but the cool, damp air on her skin. The guards were shouting about blasting powder, about digging crews. Futile. They would either bring the rest of the cliff down or succumb to the spores long before they reached him. There was no choice. Not really. She moved without thinking, her body acting on an instinct older than reason. She grabbed her worn leather satchel, already stocked with bandages, salves, and dried herbs. She slung a coil of rope over her shoulder and snatched the oil lamp from its hook. "What are you doing?" the scout demanded, seeing her stride purposefully toward the path. "I'm going in," she said. Her voice was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. The captain of the guard, a mountain of a man named Fendrel, blocked her path. His face was a mask of grim authority. "No one goes in, that's an order from the king's council." "Your king is dying in there," she stated, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "The spores will kill him faster than the rocks will. I'm the only one who can get to him." "You're a healer, not a miner. It's suicide." Alara met his gaze, her own small frame unbowed before his massive one. "Then I'll die." She stepped around him before he could react. No one else tried to stop her. They just stared, a mixture of awe and pity in their eyes, as the small woman with the healer's bag walked toward the collapsed mine, toward the tomb of their king. She didn't look back. The entrance was worse than she'd imagined. A giant maw of splintered rock and raw earth had replaced the familiar archway of timbers. The air was thick with the metallic tang of crushed iron ore, and a sweeter, cloying scent that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The whisper moss. She could see the shimmer the scout had described, a faint, oily rainbow hanging in the air. She lit her lamp, the small flame fighting against the oppressive gloom. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she found a gap in the rubble. a space barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. The world went dark. Inside, the silence was a physical weight. It pressed in on her, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the deep, and the scuttling of her own feet on loose scree. The air was cold, damp, and tasted of stone and decay. She moved cautiously, the lamps glow a tiny island in an ocean of blackness. The main tunnel was completely blocked. She'd have to find another way. She remembered old ventilation shafts, side tunnels the miners had abandoned decades ago. Her childhood explorations, once a thing of lonely rebellion, were now her only map. She found a narrow passage to the left, half hidden behind a fall of rock. It was tight, forcing her to turn sideways, her satchel scraping against the rough-hewn walls. The scent of the moss grew stronger here. Patches of it glowed with a sickly green light on the damp rock, pulsing faintly like dying hearts. Deeper she went, following the tunnel as it twisted and descended. The air grew colder. She could feel the immense weight of the mountain above her, a constant, silent threat. Every creak of shifting rock made her flinch. Then she heard it. A low groan. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was human. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her fear. She moved faster, calling out into the darkness. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Her voice echoed, swallowed by the stone. Another groan, closer this time. It led her to a larger chamber, a place where several tunnels converged. The beam of her lamp swept across the cavern and stopped. He was there. Not a great, silver-pelted wolf of legend, but a man. He was half buried under a massive, splintered support beam, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. One leg was completely pinned. His clothes, fine black wool and leather, were torn and covered in dust. Blood matted his dark hair and trickled from a gash on his temple. He was huge, even trapped and broken. Broad shoulders, a powerful frame. His face, sharp and aristocratic even under the grime, was pale as death. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, placing her fingers on his neck. His skin was shockingly cold, but there was a pulse. Faint, thready. His eyes fluttered open. They weren't the molten gold of the Alpha King she'd heard stories about. They were a clouded, disoriented gray, hazy with pain and the effects of the spores. He didn't see a healer. He saw a threat. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a primal sound of a cornered animal. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice rough. "I'm here to help you," she said, keeping her voice soft, her movements slow. She held up her hands to show she was unarmed. "I'm a healer." He stared at her, confusion warring with suspicion in his eyes. He didn't recognize her. He didn't seem to recognize himself. The collapse, the spores. He was lost in the fog. To him, she was just a stranger in the dark. "My leg," he grunted, the effort costing him. She looked at the beam. It was enormous. She could never move it alone. "We need to get the pressure off," she said, her mind racing. She wasn't a miner, but she knew leverage. She saw a long, sturdy piece of shattered timber nearby. "I need you to stay with me," she told him, her tone shifting from gentle to firm. "Don't fall asleep. What is your name?" He blinked slowly. "I don't know." The spores had taken his memory, or perhaps the blow to his head. It didn't matter. Right now he wasn't a king. He was just a man, trapped and dying in the dark. And she was his only hope. "My name is Alara," she said, "and I'm going to get you out of here." She didn't know if it was a promise she could keep. First, the bleeding. She tore a strip from her own tunic, cleaner than any cloth she had, and gently cleaned the gash on his temple. He flinched when she touched him, a tremor of pain running through his body. But he didn't pull away. His skin was like ice. The cold of the deep earth was seeping into him. "I need to try and lift this beam," she said, more to herself than to him. "Just enough to free you." She wedged the smaller timber she'd found under the massive beam, creating a makeshift lever. She put all her weight on it, her muscles straining, her teeth gritted. The beam groaned, protested, and lifted. A fraction of an inch. Not enough. "You have to help me," she gasped, the effort making her dizzy. "When I lift, you have to pull your leg free." He stared at her, his gray eyes struggling to focus. He seemed to understand. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "Ready?" she asked. He braced himself. She took a deep breath and threw her entire being into the effort. The timber creaked. Her vision swam. The beam lifted, a hand's breadth this time, the gap a sliver of hope in the crushing dark. With a raw cry of agony that echoed through the chamber, he wrenched his leg free. The moment he was clear, she let the lever go. The massive beam crashed back into place with a deafening boom that sent a shower of dust and pebbles down from the ceiling. For a terrifying second, she thought she had brought the whole chamber down on them. The dust settled. They were alive. He was lying on his side, panting, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. His freed leg was a ruin. The bone was clearly broken, jutting at a sickening angle beneath the torn fabric of his trousers. "Don't look," she commanded softly, moving to his side. She opened her satchel, her hands working with practiced efficiency. She had splints, bandages, and a paste of comfrey and willow bark for the pain and swelling. "This is going to hurt," she warned. He just grunted, his eyes squeezed shut. Setting a bone was never easy. Doing it in the dark, with a man of his size, was nearly impossible. She had to be brutal. She had to be quick. She braced his leg, took a deep breath, and pulled. He roared, a sound of pure, untamed agony that was more wolf than man. The sound slammed into her, a physical force. But she held on, her small hands an iron anchor, until she felt the bone grate back into alignment. He collapsed back, unconscious. It was a mercy. Working quickly, she slathered the thick, pungent paste onto his leg and began to bind it with the splints and linen. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the aftermath of his pain. She had felt it, a sympathetic tremor deep in her own bones. When she was done, she covered him with her own cloak. It was thin and worn, but it was all she had. He was shivering violently, the shock and cold setting in. She built a tiny, careful fire with scraps of dry timber and a bit of tinder from her pack. It was a risk. Fire consumed air, but without warmth, he would die. The small flames pushed back the darkness, casting flickering shadows on his face. In the firelight, she could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the harsh beauty of his features. There was an authority to his face even in unconsciousness, a dormant power that a layer of dirt and blood couldn't hide. A king, even when broken, was still a king. But she didn't think of him that way. He was her patient. A man named I don't know. She sat beside him, watching him breathe, her own exhaustion a heavy weight. The mine was still and silent again, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. He woke hours later. The fire had burned down to embers, and the lamp was guttering. He stirred, groaning as pain lanced through him. "Easy," she said, moving to his side. She held a small water skin to his lips. "Just drink." He drank greedily, then sagged back. His eyes were clearer now. The haze of the spores had receded, replaced by a sharp, intelligent awareness. He looked at her, then at his splinted leg, then at the remnants of the fire. "You did this?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. She nodded. "I set the bone." He touched the bandage on his head. "And this?" It wasn't a question. He was piecing it together. He looked around the chamber, his gaze analytical, assessing the collapsed tunnels. "We're trapped," he stated. "The main tunnel is gone. I came through a side passage, but I think it's unstable." He pushed himself up, ignoring the flash of pain on his face. "We have to find another way out." "You can't move," she protested. "Your leg?" "My leg will heal." He cut her off, his tone absolute. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Staying here is death. The air is thinning. He was right. She could feel it, a lightness in her head, a dull ache behind her eyes. The fire, small as it was eating their oxygen. There might be a way, she said slowly, thinking back to the old mine maps she'd seen. An old ventilation shaft. It should lead up to the cliff face, near the sea. His eyes locked onto hers. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than pain or suspicion. Respect. You know these mines. I grew up near them. Then you lead, he said. He used her cloak and a piece of rock to push himself into a sitting position. The effort left him pale and trembling. She tore a piece of her dried meat and offered it to him. He took it without a word, his gaze never leaving her. He was watching her, studying her with an unnerving intensity. It was as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. Why did you come in here? He asked, his voice quiet. The gas? It drives our kind mad. It doesn't affect me, she said simply. Why? She shrugged, looking away from his penetrating gaze. I don't know. It just doesn't. It was a question she'd asked herself her whole life. Why was she different? Why was she immune to things that crippled the strongest of wolves? He didn't press her. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The journey was a nightmare. He couldn't put any weight on his leg, so he had to half crawl, half drag himself, using his immense upper body strength. Ilara acted as his support, his guide, his third leg. She would scout a few feet ahead with the lamp, then come back and help him navigate the treacherous terrain. They moved in a bubble of shared pain and grim determination. The tunnels were a labyrinth. Several times they hit dead ends or fresh collapses and had to backtrack, the effort costing him precious energy. He never complained. The only sounds he made were sharp intakes of breath when his leg jostled, or low grunts of exertion. But she could feel his strength waning. His skin grew colder, his movements slower. They stopped to rest in a narrow passage. He slumped against the wall, his head bowed, his breathing ragged. We're not going to make it, he said, his voice flat. It wasn't despair. It was a cold, hard assessment of their chances. Yes, we are, she insisted, her voice fierce. She knelt in front of him, trying to lend him her warmth, her will. We don't stop. He looked up at her, and in the lamplight she saw the ghost of something terrible in his eyes, a deep, old wound. I was in a mine collapse before, he said, the words seeming to be pulled from him. Years ago, in the southern range. This was the guilt she'd sensed, the hidden damage. I was young, reckless. I ordered the shafts to be deepened too fast. The engineers warned me, but I didn't listen. His voice was hollow. 50 men were lost. Good men. Their families. He closed his eyes. I was the only one they pulled out alive. The Alpha's son. They dug for me. He looked at her, his gaze raw with a self-loathing that stole her breath. I don't deserve to be saved again, Ilara. The name on his lips was a strange comfort. It grounded her. That's not for you to decide, she whispered, her hand hovering just above his arm, wanting to offer comfort but not daring to touch. A low rumble started, deep in the rock. It grew quickly to a violent shudder. The ground bucked beneath them. The lamp fell from Ilara's hand and went out, plunging them into absolute terrifying blackness. The roar was deafening. Rock and earth rained down around them. Ilara cried out, throwing herself over him, trying to shield his head with her own body as the world came down. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence. She was lying on top of him, her face pressed against his chest. She could feel the faint, slow beat of his heart against her cheek. Dust filled her nose and mouth. She was shaking, but she was alive. Are you all right? She coughed. A weak sound from beneath her. a half-groan. She scrambled off him, fumbling in her pack for her flint and steel. Her hands were trembling so badly it took her 3 tries to strike a spark and relight the lamp's wick. The narrow passage was gone. Both the way they had come and the way forward were completely sealed by a wall of new rockfall. They were buried alive. The air, he rasped. She knew immediately. The space was tiny, a pocket in the rock. The air wouldn't last an hour. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She forced it down. Panicking would only use up the air faster. He was shivering uncontrollably now, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. His lips were blue. "Callum," he whispered. "What?" "My name. It's Callum." He was giving her his name before he died. The thought shattered her composure. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and useless. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare." He tried to smile, a grim twist of his lips. Fitting, isn't it, to end in the dark, in the earth? His eyes started to glaze over. "I'm sorry I got you trapped in here." "We are not dying here, Callum," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden wild rage. A rage at the mountain, at the fates, at his damned guilt that was making him give up. His breathing was shallowing, his chest barely moving. The faint heartbeat she'd felt was becoming erratic, skipping. The cold was winning. He was shutting down. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. She scrambled to him, ignoring the cramped space. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands going to his face, trying to rub warmth back into his icy skin. "Stay with me, Callum. Please." His eyes closed. His breathing stopped. That single, silent moment stretched into an eternity. The silence of the mine was now the silence of death. He was gone. She refused it. A primal, desperate denial surged through her, a force more powerful than grief or fear. She would not let him die. She would not let this place take him. She pressed her hands to his chest, right over his still heart. She closed her eyes and poured every ounce of her will, her life, her energy into him. She imagined a fire in her core, a spark of stubborn life, and pushed it through her hands into his frozen body. Live, she thought, the word a prayer, a command, a bargain with whatever gods were listening. Live. Something shifted inside her. It wasn't a burst of fire or a crackle of lightning. It was quieter, deeper. It was like a lock she never knew existed had suddenly, silently, clicked open. A strange warmth spread from her hands, a gentle, pervasive heat that had nothing to do with her own body temperature. It flowed into him, steady and calm. But it wasn't just warmth. It was a stillness, a quiet. The faint, toxic scent of the whisper moss in their little pocket of air vanished, neutralized. The oppressive weight of his guilt, a palpable aura she had felt around him since she found him, dissolved like smoke. The very air around them seemed to clear, to become pure and breathable. Her nullification power. It wasn't fire or force. It was an undoing. It canceled out poisons, toxins, and as she was now discovering, even the intangible poisons of the soul. Under her hands, his heart gave a single, powerful thud, then another. A deep, shuddering breath tore through his body. His eyes flew open. They weren't gray anymore. They were the color of molten gold, blazing with life in the lamplight. He stared up at her, his gaze filled with a stunned, profound awe. He lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the side of her face as if she were an apparition. "Alara," he breathed, his voice clear and strong. The rumbling started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the mountain groaning. It was the sound of digging. Shouts echoed from beyond the rock fall. "We found them! We have a heat signature!" Fendrel, his guards. They had found them. Callum's golden eyes never left hers. He saw her. Not just the healer, not just the woman who had saved his life. He saw the power she held, the quiet, immense strength she didn't even know she possessed. And in that moment, deep in the belly of the earth, a bond forged in darkness and desperation snapped silently and irrevocably into place. They emerged from the mine into the gray light of dawn, Callum leaning heavily on Fendrel and another guard, his face grim but his eyes blazing with a new intensity. Ilara followed, blinking in the sudden light, her clothes torn, her body aching, but her mind strangely clear. The reception was a roar of relief and disbelief. The king was alive, and the little outsider healer had brought him out. Ilara was swept up in a whirlwind she didn't understand. She was given a room in the Alpha's own wing of the Packhold, a sprawling fortress of stone and timber built into the cliffs. She was brought fine clothes she didn't know how to wear, and food so rich it made her stomach turn. She barely saw Callum. He was immediately surrounded by his council, by healers who clucked over his leg with far more ceremony than she had. She caught his eye once, across a crowded hall. The intensity in his gaze was still there, a silent promise that made her skin tingle. For a few days, she was a hero. Pack members who had ignored her for years now nodded to her in the halls, their eyes wide with respect. She was the miracle of the mine. But the whispers started soon after. They were quiet at first, like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. How did she survive the whisper moss? No one survives that. They say she uses strange herbs, things from the dark parts of the wood. Did she lead him into that mine? It's an old, cursed place. Why would the king go there? The whispers found a voice in her stepsister Bryony. Bryony was everything Ilara was not. Tall, beautiful, and politically savvy, she was the daughter of Ilara's father and his second mate, a woman of high standing. Ilara, the daughter of the first mate, a humble human woman who had died in childbirth, had always been an embarrassment. Bryony had spent their entire childhood reminding Ilara of her inferior blood and her place on the fringes. Now, seeing Ilara at the center of the king's attention, Bryony's jealousy festered into poison. She found Ilara in the castle's herb garden. "Sister," Bryony said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you've done so well for yourself, from mud-stained outcast to the king's pet." "I did what any healer would do," Ilara said, turning back to the lavender she was gathering. "Oh, but you're not just any healer, are you?" Bryony's voice hardened. "You walk through poison gas unharmed, you disappear into a collapsed mine and emerge with the king. It's a remarkable trick. Some might even call it magic." The word hung in the air, ugly and dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ilara said, her heart starting to beat faster. "Don't you?" Bryony smiled, a cold, sharp thing. "I think you do. I think you lured him there. I think you used your strange arts to trap him, to make him dependent on you. You saw your chance to crawl out of the dirt, and you took it." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Bryony's eyes glittered. "We'll see what the council thinks." The council meeting was a blur of hostile faces. Bryony stood before the elders, her voice ringing with conviction as she wove her web of lies. She spoke of Ilara's solitary life, her collection of dark herbs, her unnatural immunity. She twisted Ilara's bravery into ambition, her unique gift into a sinister witchcraft. "She is a half-blood with an unnatural resistance to pack poisons," Bryony declared, her voice rising. She knew the king was going to the cliffs. She knew of the mine's instability. She engineered the entire event to indebt the Alpha King to her. Ilara stood alone, stunned into silence by the audacity of the lies. She looked to Callum, who was seated at the head of the table, his face a thunderous mask. "These are serious accusations, Bryony," he said, his voice a low growl. "This woman saved my life." "Did she?" Bryony countered smoothly. "Or did she save you from a trap of her own making? What was our king, our mighty Alpha, doing in a forbidden mine in the first place? She must have lured him. There is no other explanation." The argument was insidious. It preyed on the pack's inherent suspicion of the unknown, of her. Callum's guilt-ridden visit to the mine was a secret. He couldn't explain why he was there without revealing a past failure that would be seen as a weakness. Bryony had him cornered. The council elders, old and wary of outsiders, murmured their agreement. She was different. She was a risk. "The law is clear," an old elder named Grolim said, his voice dry as dust. "Unsanctioned use of primal arts that endanger the Alpha is punishable by—" "Enough!" Callum's voice cracked like a whip. He stood, his healing legs still stiff, but his presence filled the room with suffocating power. His golden eyes were blazing. "I was addressing my future queen." A collective gasp filled the chamber. Alara's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Future queen? Bryony's face went white with fury. She had overplayed her hand, but Grolim, the elder, was not so easily cowed. "Your Majesty, with respect, the bond is not yet public, and she is an unranked half-blood with no standing. To make her queen, it is against all tradition." "Then tradition will change," Callum snarled. "You are weak from your ordeal, my king," Grolim said, his tone infuriatingly paternal. "Your judgment is clouded. The council must act for the stability of the pack. Until this woman's nature can be ascertained, she must be isolated, for her safety and yours." It was a coup, wrapped in the language of concern. They were using Callum's temporary weakness against him. Two of the council guards stepped forward, their faces impassive. Callum moved to stand in front of Alara, a protective wall of muscle and fury. "You will not touch her." But Alara saw the truth. He was one man, still recovering, against his entire council. If he fought them now, he would fracture the pack, risk civil war. Bryony's poison had worked. They had won. She placed a hand on his arm. He flinched as if burned, turning to her, his eyes pleading. "It's all right, Callum," she said softly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her. "Don't fight them, not for me." "I will not let them take you," he growled, his hand covering hers, his grip desperate. "You won't," she promised, though she didn't know how. "This isn't the end." She looked at the guards, at the smug triumph on Bryony's face, at the stern certainty of the elders. She lifted her chin. "I will go." The guards took her arms. As they led her from the chamber, her eyes met Callum's. The rage in his gaze was terrifying, but beneath it was a pain that mirrored her own. They had been torn apart just as they had found each other. Bryony had won. The darkness had returned. They didn't put her in a dungeon. That would have been too obvious a cruelty. They gave her a comfortable room in a remote tower overlooking the sea. It had a bed, a window with iron bars, and a locked door. A gilded cage. She was isolated. No visitors. No books. No herbs. They had stripped her of everything that made her herself. The silence and solitude were a different kind of mine, a different kind of darkness. Days bled into one another. She paced the room like a caged wolf, the sound of the surf a constant, mocking reminder of the freedom she had lost. Her thoughts circled endlessly. Callum, the mine, the brief, blazing hope, the crushing betrayal. She missed him with an ache that was physical, a hollow space in her chest. She worried for him, knowing he was fighting his counsel, fighting the whispers Bryony had unleashed. Her only human contact was the silent guard who brought her meals. And Leah. Leah was a young girl, barely a teenager, an orphan who had attached herself to Alara in the village, fascinated by the healer's craft. She was a kitchen servant in the pack-hold. On the third day of Alara's confinement, a small, clumsily wrapped package appeared on her food tray. Inside were a sprig of dried wolfsbane and a single, perfect seashell. A message. "I'm here. I believe in you." It was a tiny crack of light in the suffocating darkness. Meanwhile, Callum fought. He met with every loyal pack leader, every captain, every elder who would listen. He argued, he reasoned, he commanded. But Bryony's poison had sunk deep. The council, led by the obstinate Grolim, insisted on a purification trial for Ilara, an archaic and dangerous ritual designed to expose a witch. Callum refused, and the stalemate continued. He was the king, but he was a king in a political cage. His power checked by centuries of tradition that Bryony was now using as a weapon. He found a way to communicate. One night, a hawk landed on Ilara's window bars. Tied to its leg was a thin strip of leather. On it, in his strong, sharp script, were 3 words. I have a plan. Hope, fierce and sharp, flooded her. She didn't know what the plan was, but it was enough. He was fighting for her. Leah became their go-between. The girl was clever and nearly invisible to the high-ranking pack members. She smuggled messages, tiny scraps of information. Callum was gathering support. He was looking for proof of Bryony's lies. Bryony, however, was not idle. She saw her power solidifying. With Ilara gone and Callum hamstrung, she acted as the de facto voice of the council, her influence growing daily. And she saw Leah's devotion to Ilara as a threat, a loose end. The crisis came a week later. Leah didn't appear with the morning meal, or the midday one. A cold dread began to coil in Ilara's stomach. That evening, the hawk came again. The message was frantic. Bryony has Leah, accused her of being your accomplice. She's taking her to the old sea cave for a cleansing. It's a death sentence. The tide will... Ilara, she's trying to erase everyone who knows the truth. Meet me. A location was sketched below. A hidden cove, accessible only from the cliffs. And a time. Midnight. Her blood ran cold. Bryony wasn't just trying to secure power anymore. She was trying to murder a child to cover her tracks. Ilara looked at the bars on her window. At the sheer drop to the churning sea below. There was no way out. But there had been no way out of the mine either. She tore her bedsheets into strips, her hands working with frantic speed. She braided them together, testing the knots, her mind a cold, clear machine. The rope wasn't long enough to reach the ground, but it might be long enough to reach the ledge below. When darkness fell, she tied one end of her makeshift rope to the heaviest piece of furniture in the room and threw the other out the window. It flapped wildly in the wind, a fragile thread against the immense stone wall. She didn't hesitate. She swung out into the terrifying emptiness, her hands burning, the wind tearing at her. For a moment, she just dangled, a tiny speck against the fortress, the waves crashing hundreds of feet below. Then she began to climb down. Callum was waiting in the shadows of the cove, a silhouette of barely controlled rage. When she dropped the last few feet onto the sand, he was there, catching her, his hands gripping her arms as if to assure himself she was real. Ilara, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. For a second they just stood there, the chaos of the world falling away. There was only the sound of the waves and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Leah, she said, pulling back, her voice urgent. Where is she? The Serpent's Maw. It's a tidal cave. Bryony and Grolim have taken her there. They claim the sea itself will judge her purity. If she's innocent, the waves will spare her. It's a lie. No one survives the tide in that cave. We have to go. Now. Fendril is gathering the guards who are loyal to me, Callum said, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through her own. But they'll be too late. The tide is coming in fast. It's just us. They ran, their feet pounding on the wet sand. The Serpent's Maw was a dark slit in the cliff face, already half swallowed by the churning, rising water. They could hear Bryony's voice from inside, high and righteous. Confess your allegiance to the witch, child, and your end will be swift. A thin, terrified whimper was the only reply. Leah. Callum didn't slow. He plunged into the knee-deep water at the cave entrance, Ilara right beside him. Inside, the scene was lit by a single torch. Leah was tied to a rock pillar in the center of the cave, the water already swirling around her ankles. Bryony stood on a dry ledge, imperious and cruel. Grolim and two of his personal guards stood with her. They spun around as Callum and Alara emerged from the darkness. Bryony's face twisted in a snarl of fury. "You! How did you get out?" "You should know by now that walls don't hold her," Callum growled, his golden eyes fixed on Bryony. "It's over. Let the girl go." Grolim stepped forward. "You have no authority here, Callum. You are compromised by this creature. The trial will proceed." A wave crashed into the cave, sending a surge of water up to Leah's waist. The girl cried out in terror. That sound broke something in Alara. The fear, the injustice, the cold-blooded cruelty. It all coalesced into a white-hot point of rage. "Get away from her," Alara said, her voice dangerously quiet. Bryony laughed. "Or what, little mud witch? Will you throw herbs at me?" As she spoke, one of Grolim's guards drew his sword and advanced on Callum. "The council orders you to stand down." Callum met him, his own hands bare. He moved with a predator's grace, a blur of motion. There was a sickening crack, and the guard crumpled. But Grolim and the other guard were moving toward Leah, intending to hold her under the next wave. "No," Alara screamed. She threw her hand out, not in a spell, but in a gesture of pure instinctual command. "Stop." And they did. Grolim and the guard froze mid-stride, their bodies locked in place. It wasn't ice or force. They were simply stopped. The power that had nullified poison and guilt was now nullifying their motion, their will. Bryony stared, her mouth agape in horror and disbelief. "What? What are you?" Alara ignored her. She waded through the surging water to Leah, her hands fumbling with the wet, tight knots. Callum was by her side in a second, his knife flashing, cutting the ropes. He swept the terrified, shivering girl into his arms. Another, larger wave slammed into the cave. The torch was extinguished, plunging them into darkness. The water was at their chests, pulling at them with a deadly current. "This way!" Callum yelled, holding Leah tight and grabbing Alara's arm. He knew the caves. He led them toward the back, toward higher ground. Behind them, in the dark, they heard a shriek. It was Bryony. She had been knocked from her ledge by the wave. Then another scream from Grolim, as Alara's hold on him broke, and the undertow caught him. The sea, the false judge Bryony had invoked, was now delivering its own impartial verdict. When Fendrel and his guards finally arrived, they found Callum and Alara at the back of the cave, on a high ledge, cradling a traumatized but safe Leah between them. The entrance was a torrent of impassable water. Of Bryony, Grolim, and his guards, there was no sign. They waited for the tide to recede in the quiet dark, the only sound the drip of water and Leah's soft sobs. Callum never let go of Alara's hand. In the quiet of the cave, with the storm of their ordeal finally past, he turned to her. His golden eyes, luminous in the gloom, held a universe of emotion. "My wolf was not trapped in the mine, Alara," he said, his voice low and rough with feeling. "It was trapped in me, buried under years of guilt. You let it out." She looked at him, at this powerful king who had been so broken, at this man she had pulled back from the brink. She saw his strength, but she also saw his vulnerability, the wound he had trusted only her to see. "You saved me too, Callum," she whispered. "You saw me when no one else did." He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. The world outside, the council, the pack. None of it mattered in that moment. "I love you," he said. The words simple, absolute, and earned through fire and darkness. "I think I have since the moment I woke up in that mine and saw your face." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure joy. "I love you too," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. He pulled her to him, and in the deep, quiet heart of the earth, surrounded by the sea, he kissed her. It wasn't a king claiming his queen. It was two survivors, two halves of a whole, finally finding their way home. 6 months later, Alara stood on the balcony of the Alpha's tower, the sea breeze warm on her face. She was no longer a prisoner here. This was her home. She wore a simple blue gown, the color of the deep ocean, but on her finger was a ring of silver and iron, forged by Callum himself from ore she had gathered from the mouth of the now sealed mine. The pack had changed. After the events in the sea cave, the truth had come out. Fendrel's testimony, combined with Leah's, painted a clear picture of Bryony's treason. The council, shamed and broken, had yielded its power back to their king. Grolem's faction was disbanded, its members exiled. Callum ruled now with a new wisdom, tempered by the darkness he had faced. And Alara ruled beside him, not just as his queen, but as his partner. Her quiet strength was the perfect balance to his fiery power. Her gift of nullification was no longer seen as a curse, but as a blessing, a shield for the pack. He came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was solid and warm, a constant, reassuring presence. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "About how a collapsed mine can build a bridge," she said softly. He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes soft. "It wasn't the mine, Alara. It was you. You walked into the darkness when everyone else ran. You always do." Leah, now her official apprentice and a cherished member of their new family, ran out onto the balcony, her face bright with excitement. She held up a basket filled with glowing sea flora. "Look, Queen Alara, I found a whole colony. They're not poisonous at all, just beautiful." Alara smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her eyes. She looked from the glowing plants to the endless sea, to the strong, loving man holding her. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of the waves and the laughter of a child. She had found her place. She was no longer on the fringes. She was the heart, the quiet center of their new world.